Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track-downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Hello everyone, this is Fortune's Wheel and I'm your host Jonathan, and today we are continuing our second Patreon series supporting what's happening on the public podcast series. This new series is called Context of a Conquest. On the public podcast we're taking a deep dive into the Norman conquest of England, but here on Patreon we're asking a few extra questions about that. While the English are undergoing massive cultural, political, religious, and economic transformation, what are the other places within this worldview doing? Ireland, Scotland, Wales, other areas directly or indirectly impacted by Duke William's conquest. What are they all doing? What's going on? We know the implications of the conquest stretch far beyond England eventually, and we want to try to accurately set up these other areas with the context needed to fully grasp what occurred across the Isles in the late 11th and into the 12th century. Today, specifically, we head to the mainland, where the Northumbria of Europe, I say jokingly, of course, that is Flanders, begins to boil over into full-on civil war. I want to sincerely thank all of you who are listening to this, as you have generously donated to the production of this podcast and shown that you believe in what's happening here. There are no words for my appreciation, so I'll simply offer yet another heartfelt thank you. So, back to our second members-only series. This is episode 10, entitled Flanders in Crisis. Baldwin V was born on August 19th, 1012, just as King Ethelred struggled to maintain control of his kingdom across the Channel. By the time he was 5, both of Ethelred's powerful sons, potential kings of England, mind you, well, they were dead, not to mention Ethelred himself. By the time young Baldwin was 7, Ethelred's wife, the Dowager Queen Emma of Normandy, had visited and stayed there for a while before returning to England to marry the very man who had orchestrated the deaths of Ethelred's sons and the overthrow of her now deceased husband. This was the Dane named Canute that she married, of course. When young Baldwin turned 15 years old, he was then married. And man, she was a catch if there ever was one. Her name was Adela, and she would one day be sainted by the Catholic Church. But long before that day, Adela was simply the second daughter of King Robert II of France, and his third wife, Constance of Provence. Adela was born in 1009, so she was a mere 3 years older than Baldwin V. Though Baldwin V, by all accounts, revered her, and he allowed her far more independence and power within the Flemish court than most women throughout Europe. She was highly educated, having been treated to years being taught by the learned monks of Ghent, but she was also given the privilege of witnessing royal business quite often as well. She became a valuable member of the French royal court before being married off to not Baldwin V of Flanders, but rather Duke Robert II of Normandy. This was in 1027, but as we know, Duke Robert II didn't last very long until his brother Robert the Magnificent took over upon his death, leaving Adela coming back to her father's court in Paris. Now, while the King of France quickly surveyed the European landscape for a suitable match for Adela, mind you that Normandy's new Duke Robert and his unmarriageable tanner's daughter, Erleva, welcomed a boy into the world they named William, who would just a handful of years into the future be cast to the side as William the Bastard upon the death of his father. And as for Adela, back in 1027, her father, the king, was able to secure a marriage to another powerful leader nearby. Arguably the next best thing, if not for Normandy. That's right, Count Baldwin V of Flanders. This happy couple would welcome 3 children that we know of: Baldwin VI, a young girl named Matilda, and Robert I. It would be under this power couple of Baldwin V and Adela of France that this little backwater county to the north of both France and Germany would emerge as a very real player on the continental stage, especially when it came to navigating the tumultuous waters of North Sea politics. Now, sometime between the death of Adela's first husband in 1027 and Adela's marriage to Baldwin V of Flanders in 1028, Adela's brother assumed the role of co-ruler of sorts with his father over the entire kingdom of France. So Adela was directly connected to the king, as well as somewhat versed in how Norman politics played out. Adela, again, she was quite the catch there in 1027, 1028. Now, it would be under the reign of this power couple that Flanders truly broke onto the main stage of European politics in the 11th century, as I've said. And quite frankly, it would be through the growth experienced under Baldwin V and Adela that Flanders wouldn't leave that main stage. Flanders would, forever onward, be a force to contend with as the continent evolved over the next several hundred to 1,000 years. Backwater though it may have been at the turn of the first millennium, a haven for Vikings and crooks and pirates of all sorts, a marshy lowland with little going for it in terms of agriculture, Flanders had a unique export: cloth. See, cloth was normally produced by locals, for locals, using local wool. Cloth normally never left the community that it was produced in, around Europe that is, which is unfathomable to us today. And the weaving of cloth and the production of wearable clothing was reserved for rainy days and frigid winters when there was little else to do around the house and in the fields. Both men and women partook in the production of cloth production too, which slams in the face of stereotypes that we have. But something curious happened in the 10th century, not just in Flanders, but also around Europe in general. Though Europe would remain firmly rural for centuries more, the shift to more compact communities emerged. Now, many reasons exist for this shift, but one in particular stands out to me. Peaking around 1100 or thereabouts, the medieval warming period was in full swing by the year 900. This period saw a slight increase in surface temperatures, which resulted in a boom in agricultural output. In turn, agricultural technology and other techniques also shifted and evolved with this increased production. Now, this is an incredibly unfair summation of this really incredible time of global warming. Maybe I can get into it in more detail and do it some justice sometime in the future. But for our purposes here, this excess agricultural production allowed other specialized trades to emerge. With surplus in food comes fewer people needed in the fields. So where are these folks going? Well, villages emerged all over the old world, then towns. Slowly introduce an increase in long-distance trade, and you begin to see cities. It would be during the 11th and 12th centuries when cities as we know them today truly took shape. London was always big for its region. However, it was the influx of trade from as far away as Constantinople that allowed it to expand into a major center of economics, politics, religion, and culture. Just before the conquest in 1066, London was pushing 25,000 folks, when just a century or two earlier, they were stuck around 12,000 residents. The same growth would also occur all over the medieval warming period. For instance, Paris would shadow London until the mid-12th century, when it became a major center for northwestern trade due to it being formally organized into the French capital city in recent years. More examples include Constantinople, which rose from 250,000 people to at least 500,000 people in 1000, though some historians claim it could have hovered around 1 million. Cordoba, as we've mentioned before on the public podcast, an incredibly important large city, was around 350,000 residents just before its collapse in the early 11th century. Kiev doubled London with upwards of 50,000 residents. Dublin rose to more than 10,000 residents by 1100. Amalfi down on the Italian peninsula and Genoa up on the Italian mainland both had 80,000 people around the year 1000. The jewel of the Mediterranean, Palermo, Sicily. Best estimates, due to lack of records and archaeologists doing their best with what they have, put its population hovering somewhere between 100 and 300,000. Either way, under Muslim leadership, Palermo, Sicily was booming. So we can assume, looking at other cities around Europe, that Flemish cities like Bruges and Ghent and Yves also swelled in number. But using caution, it's safe to say that they simply didn't grow into the same sizes as the cities listed above. Nevertheless, this shift from field to town affected Flanders for sure. And under Count Baldwin V, he knew what Flanders lacked in tillable soil. It excelled in skilled artisans due to the proximity to Scandinavian trade, which required a different set of skills, those of business. And business required an evolution during this time as well. Imports were where Flanders excelled. Just like Japan of the last several decades here today, Flanders imported all the materials necessary to create industries of its own. And Flanders already had its own well-known product, as I said. As far back as Charlemagne, what was called Frisian cloth was highly valued as far as Muslim Iberia and Constantinople. By mid-11th century, Flanders was importing massive amounts of wool from England and Germany, and these Frisian cloth exports exploded onto the European scene, becoming so ubiquitous with nobility and royalty from horizon to horizon that Flanders was able to bask in the light of European power and influence. This odd mixture of climate change, solid leadership, and a set of unique skills put Flanders in just the right place at just the right time to make young Baldwin V just the right kind of match for Adela, the niece of the French king. And to add to Flemish influence, it would be the market of Flemish clothiers who collectively standardized the production of cloth around the continent. Clothing, just one of the things that we take for granted today, had such an impact. By the time of Baldwin V's marriage to Adela, Flanders was already a real presence, which we've already seen time and time again on the podcast. The Godwins, for instance, leaned on them periodically for decades, even as recently as 1069, when Githa made a stop in Bruges, trying to drum up support for a coup before moving on to Denmark. But what would tip the scales in Flanders' favor would be another marriage altogether, one that would eclipse Baldwin and Adela's, if you can believe it. And this is where we will jump a bit in the timeline here, from the births of Adela's 3 children around the early 1030s, to one particular wedding we're quite familiar with by now. Baldwin and Adela's middle child, Matilda, and the Norman bastard, Duke William. This seemingly match made in hell would turn out to be quite the opposite. Given the accounts left to us, William and Matilda's marriage was, as we know, quite effective. And I chose that word effective with a great amount of forethought. Sure, we're told it was a loving one as well, one in which both man and woman were free from any temptations toward infidelity or the like. This marriage is also seen as quite progressive in a sense that both man and woman had a say within the relationship, and Matilda did every medieval noblewoman one better and became a political influencer and even the periodic ducal figurehead while her husband was away. The marriage was quite utilitarian as well, for the reasons just mentioned, as Matilda was exactly the counterbalance to William's rather, shall we say, bull in a china shop attitude toward problem solving. But this word effective seems to not only encapsulate all of this, but it also seems to embody the spirit of what they created as well. William and Matilda's relationship produced 2 kings, 2 dukes, an influential abbess, not to mention a kingdom, and a Norman duchy that reached its largest iteration through its acquisition of the County of Maine, as well as small parts of Anjou and Brittany. And its juggernaut appearance also forced the King of France himself to fall back for a number of years. But something else it did for a good, solid 2 decades was quell the very real issues between Normandy and Flanders. Normandy was already something to contend with by the marriage of William and Matilda, while Flanders was still standing up fully economically. Flanders simply didn't have the battlefield prowess that Normandy had. It never really needed it, to be quite honest, as its lowlands and marshy areas, as we've said, didn't offer much in the way of war-worthy prizes, though its ports were seen as valuable. Still not enough to expend time, coin, and blood on, though. However, where they stood on Frankish politics and where they stood on England were 2 points of contention between them. Remember, Ethelred's wife, Emma, was Norman, but Normandy also reneged on their approach to English-Danish warfare, allowing Danish and Norse Vikings to use their ports for a time. So this back and forth went on and on and on until the Danish took over England. All the while, Flanders became chummy with the powerful Godwins. For a couple decades, Flanders and Normandy weren't exactly amiable. Then, out of nowhere, William rides to Flanders, beats up the Count's daughter, and they get married. So now we have Duke William of Normandy directly tied to Count Baldwin V of Flanders, again, smoothing over a few rough decades between the 2 Frankish polities. What's more, through Matilda, William is now somewhat directly tied to the Frankish crown, a crown he'd spent the better part of 2 decades embarrassing over and over again. William couldn't have asked for a better arrangement. However, this of course didn't go around very well. Anjou, Brittany, Boulogne, Maine, these various regions were now directly threatened by this alliance. Matilda's father, Baldwin V, by the time of her wedding day, had already lived quite a life. Between 1046 and 1056, that decade, while William was still fighting for legitimacy in Normandy and England was edging closer and closer to a massive civil war between King Edward II and the powerful Earl Godwin and his children, he was tied up, that is, Baldwin V, was tied up in Duke Godfrey III's war against Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. Baldwin had ceded some land to the emperor's ally in the County of Hainault, but when the man he'd lost it to died in 1049, right smack in the middle of the larger conflict, Baldwin had a plan. He arranged his eldest son, Baldwin VI, to marry the guy's widow, Rochilda, which consequently pushed her children completely aside in terms of succession, and Baldwin VI assumed the role of the Count of Hainault, firmly within the Flemish sphere of influence. For the remaining 7 years, a reinvigorated Count Baldwin V reaffirmed his commitment to his ally in Lower Lorraine against the emperor, and this would pay off. Around that time that Earl Harold Godwinson was becoming one of King Edward II's closest allies across the Channel, and his daughter was beginning to produce heirs in Normandy, Baldwin V had reached the pinnacle of his power. It was actually a series of events that began with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III dying in 1056, thus ending the war and solidifying Baldwin's gains in Hainault, which included the important cities of Mons, today in Belgium, and Valenciennes, today in France, and ending with the death of the French king, Henry I, in 1060. I know I'm throwing a lot out here, but a lot's happening. These 4 years would see quite a bit happening all around him. And, as for Flanders itself, these 4 years would also see quite a boon in trade in and out of Flemish ports and cities. Baldwin V became a very, very rich man. And with wealth comes influence. So why would the death of the French king, though, have anything to do with his rise to power? Well, King Henry I of France and his wife Anne of Kiev had a son in 1052 that they named Philip. Upon the death of Henry I, Philip I took over. Kind of. He was only 8 years old, so he needed regents to handle things and teach him the ropes until he reached majority. You all know that drill by now. But this just shows how incredibly far Flanders had risen in the previous few decades. The French court had plenty of other options to co-regent while Philip became of age, but they chose the Flemish Count Baldwin V to co-regent along with Philip's mother, Anne of Kiev. I mean, sure, it helped that through his wife Adela, King Philip I was his nephew. But the French monarch was related to others as well. Why Baldwin V? Well, I think that's obvious. Flanders had proven itself more than worthy. These two, Baldwin V and Anne of Kiev, would guide young Philip I, by all accounts, pretty well. Some highlights of his co-regency period include the succession crisis in England, including his granting Earl Harold Godwinson safe passage through Flanders, as well as negotiating the same with the Kingdom of Germany, recent enemy, on his way to Hungary, seeking Edward the Exile on behalf of King Edward II. Another, navigating William's unruly rulership that time and again humiliated the French crown and its allies. Another, he navigated the absolutely treacherous waters of the mini-civil war within the House of Godwin between Harold and Tostig. And we can't forget that Tostig had married Baldwin V's daughter, Judith of Flanders, way back in 1051. This is another marriage that resulted in a seemingly faithful and effective bond between husband and wife. Emma of Normandy spent some time there as well in her older age as Baldwin V's honored guest, to which she was forever indebted to him and the city of Bruges, who came to absolutely adore her. And finally, it was during this time that William had expanded his rule across the Channel. No indication exists, as far as I can tell, that Baldwin V had any hand in helping nor hindering William's plans toward England, which also speaks volumes either way. And it was on the 1st of September, 1067, that Baldwin V, shall we say the Great? Well, he died. His son, Baldwin VI, now 37 years old, who had already been an integral part of his rule through the arranged marriage with Countess Rochilde of Hainaut, became the new Count of Flanders.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtuo Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your Virtuo Pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
And by this time, Baldwin VI was primed for this role, and he was by all accounts a good man for the age. He's described much like his father, which didn't seem to be a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. Not only had he been a piece of most courts held by his father, but he also was a seasoned leader on the battlefield in Baldwin V's many engagements against Emperor Henry III, and a seasoned ruler as the Count of Hainaut for over a decade. To assume the role of Count of both Hainaut and Flanders was a massive step upward politically. And while his brother-in-law raged against the English across the Channel, he navigated the rough waters of his father's close bonds with the House of Godwin and the familial bonds with that same crazy Norman Duke who now fashioned himself King of England. Though all reports say that his sister was a boss holding down the duchy in William's absence, so some level of sibling pride must have existed when considering Normandy. Now, reports do emerge of Githa, as I said earlier, landing in Bruges looking for help in 1069, but she was gently refused by Count Baldwin VI. setting her on her way further east to her kin in Denmark. But honestly, those are the highlights of Baldwin the Sixth's rule, his potential forever lost to history due to his early death just 3 years into his rule over Flanders and Hainaut. Luckily, Richilde had given him 2 sons that we know of in Arnulf III, he was born in 1055, and Baldwin II of Hainaut in 1056, to aid in a smooth succession, much like his own succession. Yeah, about that. Arnulf III was 15 years old when his father passed, and he was ready to assume control of Flanders, his mother initially co-regent, for just a year or 2 longer until he reached full majority, while his little brother Baldwin took over the lesser title of Count of Hainaut, mom being again co-regent of there as well. However, the age-old trope of the jealous uncle reared its ugly head in 1070. Baldwin V's 3rd child, his youngest son, Robert, had his own plans for the County of Flanders, and it looked like his nephew, Arnulf III, was standing directly in his path. Now, Robert's brother, though, before his death, gave the safety and security of his sons to Robert. But Robert quite quickly, ripped up his oaths to his late brother and brought the issue of succession to the Flemish court, as well as bringing upon himself the ire of his sister Matilda. From here, a series of events fell just like dominoes. Robert calls the succession of Arnulf III into question. Co-regent Richilde immediately called in reinforcements in the form of her kinsman through marriage, King Philip I of France, who sent an order for Robert to show up in the royal court to speak of his concerns. Robert told the king where he could go. King Philip ordered troops to Flanders to protect Arnulf and his mother. And at this point, things got real. Like really real. Really quick. So, not only were French troops sent on behalf of the king, but our old friend Count Eustache II of Boulogne also accompanied this force to protect the Flemish court. But Arnulf's aunt, Queen Matilda of England, also sent Norman knights to fight on her nephew's behalf as well, though it was quite smaller than expected. Just 10 Norman knights and 1 nobleman were offered. If you think about when this was, 1070, right smack in the middle of William's infamous harrying of the north, and with other issues happening all around England and all along Normandy's borders with Maine and Brittany, William ordered Matilda not to send too many warriors. In fact, he didn't want her to send any at all, initially. He simply couldn't afford the loss of manpower, while his grips on both polities were so precariously tenuous. As I mentioned before, 1069 to 1070 was a time that we take quite for granted these days. There was obviously every reason to believe that William's time was up, that this conquest was coming to an abrupt end. In fact, his life even. One key figure William told Matilda to send was his most trusted confidant and longest-lasting friend, William Fitzosborne, who was at the time adding a military face to the duchy's many problems, a counterbalance to Matilda's calmer and more traditional leadership. Now, King William had already sent an incredibly trusted and brutal presence in England at exactly the same time he could have used him the most. But the Earl of Hereford, since 1067, mind you, was right in the middle of a large number of castle-building projects, including his favorite residence on the Isle of Wight. However, the king's needs took him to Normandy, so ever the loyal friend and servant, William Fitzosborne helped Matilda dutifully until he was sent to Flanders, which, if you followed the way things had been going for the last handful of years, might reap untold rewards for him. Maybe in the form of the County of Flanders itself. Now that would pay dividends for generations if he could just hold that one. Hey, longer shots were realized during the 1060s when it came to Norman expansion, so there's no way to say that this is entirely unreasonable. So, off William Fitzosborne went, along with 10 other Norman knights. Now, forever known as Robert the Frisian, Uncle Robert amassed his own loyalist forces and traveled toward the Flemish town of Cassel, today in France, where he lined up against the forces of Arnulf III. Across the fields from Robert were not only the Flemish army supporting Arnulf, but also King Philip I of France, William Fitzosborne of Normandy and England, Count Eustache II of Boulogne, along with his son, Eustace III of Boulogne, and Godfrey of Bouillon. Now get this Godfrey guy, spoiler alert, this guy would become the first king of Jerusalem within 4 decades from this moment. So put a pin in that one. Now, I'm a big fan of breaking down battles, but I've been unable to locate many details about what became known as the Battle of Cassel. What we know is that on February 22nd, 1071, Robert the Frisian surprised his nephew and his menagerie of Frankish heavy hitters, and mass casualties ensued. It was bloody, and it was brutal, and many, many lives were lost on both sides, including some of those heavy hitters. It turns out that young Arnulf III was killed during the battle. Rochilde was captured by Robert's forces, and in a strange twist of fate, Robert himself was in return captured by Count Eustache. In exchange for a peaceful resolution with Arnulf already dead, Rochilde and the French crown decided to free Robert and give him the title of Count of Flanders. However, there would be interesting implications from this battle with regards to William and his hold on his new embattled kingdom. William Fitzosborne, he was also among the dead in the Battle of Cassel. And as his body was brought back to Normandy for a proper Norman burial, the news reached William across the Channel, and he was, in typical fashion, beyond enraged. Matilda, having taken her nephew's side on the matter, forever distanced herself with her younger brother, Count Robert I of Flanders. However, her family's internal strife sucked in the rest of France and cost William a childhood friend and a massive figurehead in the subjugation of England. The Battle of Cassel, for Matilda's family, was not only a blow to the seemingly smooth nature of the Flemish noble family, but it was also a blow to her relationship with her husband William. Though she and William were on the same side of the issue, William already didn't like the idea of sending Normans to fight, not at that point, which is why it was just 10 Norman knights who went. But the loss of such an important leader within the duchy and now the Kingdom of England, that was just a step too far. Again, though he and Matilda were on the same page regarding the conflict, William went against his better judgment in order to appease his wife, and as we said, it cost him dearly. But William would experience another massive blow in the coming month or so back in England that would further distance himself from his wife and set up one of the toughest conflicts in his entire life. And for a man like William the Conqueror, that's saying something. Well, I hope this episode filled in some gaps about the goings-on of mainland Europe, specifically between 1066 and 1071. There are loads more to come, both on the public feed as well as Patreon, so please consider staying connected and also sharing with friends on your social media. Thank you all so much. Thank you for listening. Until next time.